Chapter 6. After traveling for another several days, the group approached the heap of rust and rubble that was once the healing shrine. This land was filled with scars from battles fought recently, as well as those fought by the Destroyer and the Guardians of the Divine Keys before the world plummeted into chaos. The sky was thick with dark clouds, even though there was more daylight than night in this region. Old springs from hospital mattresses were heaped in piles, along with rusted carts and medical equipment that had been well scavenged. Though there were no visible corpses, the stench of rotting flesh filled the air. The only one of them that was visibly bothered by their surroundings was Jennifer. Sig could not help but smile when Lucas confirmed they were very close to where the old shrine had been located. Somewhere in one of the caves or crevices in this area, he hoped to find the Heaven's Breath key, the divine key of healing. Having the ability to instantly cure serious wounds would be vital in their dangerous work. Sig's excitement was contagious. Lizard was scurrying around scouting ahead of everyone more frequently. Of course, this may have been more fear of Felix Light than excitement to recover a divine key. Lucas and Victor had been looking at maps and comparing observations. Daniel was hopeful that digging for something long buried would be safer than most of their typical jobs. Jonathan seemed happy even when he was not next to Kirana. "It's close now," announced Sig happily. "Isn't this exciting, Kirana?" asked Jonathan. "No," said Kirana coldly. Jonathan looked at Victor and shrugged. Victor smiled sympathetically. "I agree with Kirana," said Daniel Young as he smelled the air. "Who can even number the deaths that turn this place into a graveyard?" "Tens of thousands," guessed Jennifer. "Hundreds of thousands, probably," guessed Daniel. "All those precious lives." Jennifer decided she did not want to walk next to the grumpy physician. She quickened her pace to stand next to Victor and Lucas. "Do you know what the building looked like?" asked Jennifer curiously. "Yes," said Lucas as he handed her a piece of paper from his pack. She unfolded it and looked at it. The paper had a sketch depicting a wide building with a tall spire. As soon as she saw it, she began looking around in confusion. "It's not here anymore," said Lucas. "You won't see it." "I know, it's just," started Jennifer. "Something is not right. The whole area seems off." "Off?" asked Victor curiously. "Do you remember something?" "Maybe," said Jennifer. She found Victor's voice soothing. Perhaps it was the fact he was a recent addition to the group, and even though she was aware of his attraction to her and the subtle flirting in which he was engaging, she enjoyed being with him. Everyone else in the group seemed to be specialized in something, but it was as if he was... She thought about what adjective described Victor Lee. After a moment, she decided on balanced. He was balanced. Though she had not wanted to divulge her opinions to anyone, she let an observation fall from her lips. "Don't things seem older than they should here?" she whispered. "And what of the sleeping sickness? There are no signs of patience." "Sleeping sickness?" asked Victor with confusion. "I've never heard of it." "But everyone should know of it by now," said Jennifer. "And why is everything so blown up?" "The battles that have been fought here were generations ago," said Lucas. She had forgotten that Lucas was a participant in the conversation. She decided she did not like him. While he was certainly smart, she was aware of his determination to learn her origins. She knew that he was frustrated that he had not yet determined what her divine key was. "I just," started Jennifer in a frustrated tone. "I feel like I'm supposed to be finding something. I feel like I'm late, or slow, or sidetracked." Victor handed her the piece of paper he had worked on in researching the divine keys. "I worked on that for years, trying to fulfill the dying wishes of my parents," said Victor. "I was slow. I got sidetracked. But I think I'm doing the right thing. I kind of know what you mean, though." As Jennifer looked at the symbols on the page, she smiled. A few symbols on a sheet of paper seemed too small a reward for the effort he had invested. Yet he had done it anyway. His dedication was admirable. It took years just to find those, and for a long time it felt kind of pointless, like I was being sidetracked from living my life. "You don't think you're being sidetracked now?" she asked. He turned to her, smiled, and shook his head. She smiled back. "I'm sure things will become clear as we find more of the divine keys," said Victor. She handed his paper back to him. "I hope so," she said. She had gone along with everyone because she had nowhere else to go, but she realized they were bound together by fate or destiny, or at least she thought it must be something like that. Bearers of divine keys were supposed to stick together. She suddenly wondered if she felt that way because of her vivid dreams of Drew and the Destroyer, or perhaps she just hated solitude and these people allowed her to stay with them. "Stop," whispered Lucas in a hushed voice. He motioned to everyone else to stop and pointed out a spot on the horizon. Kirana trained her sniper rifle at the shadow that moved ever so slightly in the distance and looked through her scope to see if she could identify the source. Though the sun had set, there was still light from the bright chunks of moon in the sky that illuminated several figures in the distance. "Augments?" asked Sig anxiously. "Not augments," said Kirana in a low voice. She held very still so as not to upset the motion of her weapon. "I think they're demon worshippers." There was a sudden whoosh of air, and to everyone's surprise, Felix Light stood right next to Kirana. He was tall and had long, dark, straight hair pulled into a ponytail. His eyes had a red glow to them in the low light. His muscular arms were bare, but he had a long black vest and long black pair of pants that seemed to flow with the breeze. His skin was tinted red, except for the black tattoos that covered his arms and face. Unlike augments that like to travel in packs if they needed to move, he had no problems confronting large numbers of people by himself. Though he made no sound, his arrogance was deafening. In a blur, Kirana found her weapon had been knocked away. Lizard scurried as fast as he could. "Felix!" shouted Lizard as he threw his fist toward his former master. Felix was far quicker, and the instant that Lizard realized his punch would not connect, he took a swift kick to the gut, knocking him back. "There are no lasers to help you here, Lizard," said Felix with a smile. Lizard got up to his knees. "As if I need lasers," said Lizard with air quotes. Jonathan leapt toward Felix and swung his swords in a ferocious combo. Felix was able to jump back. Sig fired several rounds, but his bullets seemed to slow down as Felix nimbly pulled himself through the line of fire. Kirana kept slashing her own swords, but to her surprise, Felix grabbed Jonathan and pushed him into Kirana's slash. Jonathan cried out as his back was lacerated. Kirana abandoned her stoic expression as blood dripped down Jonathan's back. Jonathan forgot his pain when he saw the rare look of concern on Kirana's face. Determined to show his grit, he smiled back. "I'm fine, Kirana," said Jonathan. Kirana glared at him for a moment, but quickly turned back to face Felix. Victor stood with his weapon drawn to protect Jennifer, who was unarmed and practically shaking with fear. Victor fired a couple rounds as Felix rushed toward him, but they missed. Fortunately, Lizard leapt up to counter. While Felix was not hit, he was not able to hurt Victor or Jennifer. "Kirana!" shouted Sig anxiously. She spun around and nodded. "I know," she shouted. Lucas fired a flare as he protected Daniel. Felix winced at the bright light and rushed toward Sig. Sig tried to swing, but Felix easily avoided his punch and delivered a combo of blows to Sig. In spite of the quick jabs and kicks that Sig took, he seemed to be smiling. This infuriated Felix. "I'm guessing you're not the brains of this operation," said Felix as he punched Sig in the gut. "Set off the flash bomb now, Lucas," shouted Sig. Felix whirled around to see Lucas pulling the pin on a flash grenade. Anticipating the light, he rushed toward Lucas. As Felix ran, he pulled a thin cable that he had failed to notice in his haste. The sound of pins sliding out of grenades on either side of him filled him with horror. He turned and rushed away. The others ducked and covered their eyes and ears as best they could. The blast of the grenades was relatively small, but the searing bright light filled the entire area. Lizard smiled as he recognized the owner of the shriek that echoed across the land as Felix Light. "Let's go," shouted Lucas as he pointed to a large crack in the rocks ahead. Lizard scurried around to help the others get up. "Lucas is right," said Lizard as he gave Daniel a hand. "Felix will be unpleasant when he recovers." "You mean he was being pleasant to us there?" asked Jennifer as Victor helped her up. They walked down quickly. Bent rusted bars jutted out of concrete chunks that littered the ground. Graffiti of various kinds had been painted on the ruins, some of it dedicated to pro-augment messages, some of it crossing those messages out. All of it was faded. Marking territory had become far less important than holding territory, as the abundance of shell casings in the cracks bore witness. It was not long before they came to a thick stone slab deep in the crevice. This was less like the concrete that made up forts and structures. It was far stronger. The damage to this slab had been caused by a beam of intense heat and power, and the cuts and holes in it showed that it had been melted. Victor shuddered as he saw the damage. He knew that this type of damage could only have been caused by the destroyer. "How close are we, Lucas?" asked Sig with a wide smile. His eagerness was like a ray of sunshine piercing dark clouds. Lucas nodded and pointed to a heap of rubble. "It's there," he said. Sig rushed to the heap and began throwing large concrete chunks off of the pile. "The sooner we find it, the sooner we can return to high ground," said Lucas, as he joined the effort in clearing rubble. Victor, Lizard, Jonathan, and Kirana immediately began pulling debris away. Jennifer and Daniel tried to look more carefully in the cracks with flashlights, hoping to see a reflective surface under the dust. The work went steadily for about an hour. Sorting through debris was difficult work, but it was far less life-threatening than their typical tasks. Lizard scurried back and forth quickly. His attention was divided between searching for the key and searching for a sign that his former master had returned. He worried that the flash grenade had upset him to the point he would bring others. While Felix was certainly capable of handling everyone himself, the addition of others would make using a similar flash grenade technique impossible. His goons could help protect him from exposure to the one thing he hated: light. He thought back to Jennifer's observation that it was ironic someone who was named Light should hate it so much. As Lizard looked up, he saw for a brief moment a shadow. The ground shook as Sig chucked a huge piece of concrete away from the heap. Lizard looked over at Lucas with wide eyes. Lucas knew that he was thinking and immediately pulled out a flash grenade. They looked all around as the others continued to search for a sign of the divine key. Lizard strained his ears and darted his head back and forth looking for any sign of motion. A minute passed, then another. He wanted to believe he had only seen an animal, or that the wind had blown a discarded plastic bag into the air. He longed to return his attention to the work, but the nagging feeling of being watched and the threat that Felix represented compelled Lizard to keep scanning for enemies. He briefly glanced at the others to ensure they were still safe. Lucas peered around defensively with him, but the others seemed oblivious to the danger. Sig grinned as he heaved huge chunks of concrete and rock out of his way. Victor and Jonathan worked together to do the same. Kirana pulled smaller chunks away herself. Daniel and Jennifer searched in piles of loose debris. Lizard looked at Jennifer and frowned. He wished her divine key might give them some advantage here, because not even his speed could compete with Felix's. Suddenly another shadow blurred by from overhead, breaking Lizard's chain of thought. Lizard scurried up to investigate, but as soon as he reached the top, he saw nothing. He whirled back down just in time to see Lucas get knocked down. "Felix!" shouted Lizard angrily as he rushed down. In another instant, Victor and Jonathan had been thrown to the ground. Kirana drew her swords just in time to get hit in the back of the head. The blades skidded away from her as she hit the hard stone. "What did you think would happen when I found you, Lizard?" asked Felix as he slowed down temporarily. Sig fired a couple rounds, but Felix rushed out of the line of fire, causing the bullets to ricochet off the stone. Lizard rushed to try and defend Sig, knowing that Felix would strike there next, but he was not quick enough. Sig was thrown back. "What do you want?" screamed Lizard. "What do you even want?" Daniel tried to help Lucas get up, but several other blurring figures swarmed around them and stripped them of their flash grenades. "I must appease the demon that grants us our speed," said Felix, as he punched Daniel in the face, knocking him out. "You never really understood why they call us demon worshippers," said Felix with air quotes. Lizard rushed to defend Jonathan and Victor, who were attacking Felix's goons. Kirana rushed for her swords, but Felix kicked her in the head, knocking her unconscious. "Kirana!" shouted Jonathan angrily. After another moment, Felix punched Lizard, throwing him off the heap of rubble. In a blur, he rushed to Victor and Jonathan, throwing them off as well. "Demons demand sacrifices," explained Felix. "And while augments like Zeta-28 were enough to keep them appeased for a month or so, her genetically enhanced smart and strong experiments bought considerably more time. You never intended to sell me," said Lizard with air quotes as he got to his feet. "You intended to sacrifice us all to the demons." "We have a few more months, maybe even a few years," said Felix. "But I know something about you. A sacrifice of your caliber could provide 1,000 years of speed to us." Lizard barreled into a group of goons and knocked them out. Their dark hoods fell and exposed their tattooed faces. Felix spun and kicked Lizard, throwing him back. As he rolled to his feet, he looked at his friends. Sig had been surrounded by a group of goons, and while he was strong, he was taking repeated hits to his face. The others were either unconscious or struggling to get up. "Fine," shouted Lizard. "I will come with you, but only if you leave these people be." "Stop it, Lizard," shouted Daniel angrily. "Don't say such—" "Shut up, Doctor," interrupted Lizard. "We must not give in to these demon worshippers," said Daniel, ignoring Lizard. "Your life has a greater purpose than this." "Doctor," shouted Lizard, "you and Sig had greater purpose when you risked your lives to save me. I'm returning the favor." "Lizard," said Jennifer fearfully. Lizard had forgotten about Jennifer. "Please listen to the doctor. We just need a little more time to find it. Then we'll be okay." "If you present yourself, then I will not hurt your insignificant band of friends," said Felix with a wide smile that seemed to shine in the low light. Lizard scowled, knowing that his promise was nearly worthless, but wondered if he could at least buy time for his friends. "Please, Lizard," said Jennifer softly. The pleading in her voice was unexpected. While Lizard had carried her away from the slavers with great speed, he had not felt particularly close to her, certainly not the way Victor seemed to have become. "We are out of time, Jennifer," he said softly as he got to his feet. "If I do not find a way to stop him, it will be up to you and Dr. Young." "We can stick together," protested Daniel, "just as we always have." "Not this time, Doctor," said Lizard. Felix slowly walked toward Lizard. "I don't want to see any of my friends hurt," said Jennifer as her eyes welled up with tears. Lizard smiled at her compassion. "If self-preservation gives me pause," he said with air quotes, "then I do not deserve your friendship." Lizard's words brought back to her mind in vivid detail her dream with Drew. "If self-preservation gives me pause, then I do not deserve my heavenly shield." Her eyes widened, and she grew distant from her surroundings. The darkness of the crevice and the shoves of Felix's goons became meaningless. She watched in horror as Lizard darted at Felix. His minions began swarming around Lizard to hold him down. He spun around with a swift kick and knocked 3 of them down. They swiftly punched him in his face and body. By the time the blurring battle slowed down, Lizard was restrained with blood dripping out of his mouth down his chin. "Surely you understand," said Felix with a wide smile. "We need to slice your leg muscles to prevent you from escaping." He drew a large knife from a sheath on his arm. The sound of the blade leaving its scabbard made something inside Jennifer snap. She furrowed her brow and grabbed the key that hung about her neck. Felix began to slow down as he approached Lizard. She looked around in sudden amazement as everything began to slow down to a crawl. She knew she had unlocked the power of her key, but she was unsure of exactly what was happening. She watched Felix grab Lizard's leg to slice it and gripped her key tighter. "This time," she whispered, "I will not be late." She sprinted as fast as she could toward Lizard. The goons that had surrounded her were knocked into the air as she bumped them, but they did not immediately fall. She ignored her floating enemies and rushed toward Lizard. Her key began glowing brightly. She noticed Felix's key began absorbing light as if it were growing darker. He spun toward Jennifer with his knife, but it was at normal speed instead of the blurring velocity with which he had been moving. Jennifer ducked, spun around, and kicked Felix in the gut, pushing him back. He flew and crashed into another pair of his goons that had been next to Daniel Young. Felix's eyes were filled with fury and nearly glowed in the darkness. Jennifer stood her ground and kept her guard up as Felix lunged toward her. She sidestepped as Felix flew by her and skidded across the ground. Everyone appeared to be frozen in place, except for Jennifer and Felix as they faced each other. Felix began slashing with his knife. Jennifer backed up, avoiding his attacks. She spun around and tried to kick him again, but he blocked her and pushed her back. She flipped onto her feet and glared at Felix. "You would do well to leave Lizard alone," she said angrily. "You may have found a way to keep up with me," laughed Felix, "but you will not deprive me of my sacrifice." Felix lunged with his knife. Jennifer spun and pushed Felix's arm out of her way as she punched him in the face. He backed up for a moment, but then grinned and head-butted her. She backed up, dazed by the attack. He lunged again, and this time he pressed his weapon into Jennifer's stomach. Suddenly, everything around them appeared unfrozen as Jennifer looked at the handle of Felix's weapon protruding from her gut. "Jennifer!" shouted Daniel in horror. "Felix!" shouted Lizard in anger. "None of them were to be hurt." "Don't play dumb, Lizard. You know what you have hidden from me," said Felix angrily. "She matched my speed." Lizard's eyes grew wide as he looked at the woman who he had amazed with his own speedy rescue. "But I was still too late," said Jennifer sadly. Felix yanked the knife from Jennifer's body and kicked her. She slumped to the ground and grew motionless. Lizard stared at her for another moment, and then shrieked in rage. He twisted around and threw Felix's goons off of him. One after another they rushed to subdue him, but he scurried with amazing speed and disabled them all. Finally he whirled around to face Felix. Breathing heavily and clenching his fists, he pulled out a long knife from the sheath on one of the unconscious minions on the ground. Felix smiled. Lizard rushed at his former master, spinning and slashing with tremendous speed, but Felix dodged his attacks and began lunging with his weapon. Lizard parried and lunged, but Felix parried and kicked Lizard in the gut. Felix tried to follow up with a stabbing lunge, but Lizard spun around and kicked Felix in the chest, knocking him back. Felix leapt up and began running in circles around Lizard. Lizard tried to attack, but Felix countered with a slash. His attack sliced Lizard's arm, drawing blood. Felix laughed as he slashed again, cutting Lizard's back. Ignoring the pain, Lizard spun and slashed with his weapon, but Felix pushed the attack out of the way and kicked Lizard in the face. As Lizard staggered back, he threw his knife at Felix with tremendous force. In the darkness in the crevice, the metal on the blade seemed to glow as it flew through the air, reflecting a little of the light of the 2 chunks of moon in the sky. Felix tried to dodge, but Lizard's attack hit his knife, sending both weapons several yards away. Felix turned to rush for them, but Lizard hit him in the back, knocking him to the ground. The dry dust clouded the air as the 2 men struggled for position. Felix scrambled on the ground to scoop up a weapon, but Lizard held on to his ankle, holding him back. Felix spun around and kicked Lizard in the face. Lizard held tight in spite of the blood dripping down his chin. Dust stuck to the sweat and blood on his face, and even in the darkness, Lizard appeared less human and more like a chameleon changing its color. Felix's eyes seemed to shine in the darkness as he gritted his teeth. Felix kicked him again and again until Lizard finally fell back, and Felix was free to get the knives. Felix got up as quick as he could. Lizard's expression, though coated with a muddy mixture of blood, sweat, and dust, was clearly one of fear for his friends. It was up to him to protect everyone now, and Felix was scrambling through the dusty air to pick up a weapon. Lizard leapt to his feet, but froze suddenly with shock. It took a moment for him to process what he saw through the dusty air and in the shadows. He blinked repeatedly to take in the sight that greeted him. Slowly the dust in the air began to settle. Though he saw with greater clarity, he still wondered if what he was seeing was real. Jennifer Cedar had, in an instant, pinned Felix to the ground, and Victor, Lucas, and Sig had guns pointed at him. Kirana and Jonathan securely tied flash grenades to him and were stringing out wire that had been tied to the pins as they backed up in opposite directions. The strategy was brilliant. If Felix attempted to escape in any direction, the tension on at least one of the wires would pull a grenade pin. Lizard gasped for air as he tried to process what had happened. As the dust continued to settle, the elderly doctor, Daniel Young, stepped forward clutching a shining key. Felix asked the question before Lizard could. "What? How?" he stammered. Daniel frowned as he looked at Felix. "Heaven's breath," said Lucas with a smile. "The divine key of healing." "This place was once a great shrine of healing," said Daniel in a low voice. "And though it now rests in the wake of the destroyer's ruin, there will be no more death here tonight." Felix scowled at the doctor. "You cannot deny me my sacrifice indefinitely," he said defiantly. Jennifer got up, allowing Felix to stand. Sig walked up to Kirana, who was holding a wire attached to a pin. "Deny you your sacrifice?" scoffed Sig. "Lizard does not belong to you. You simple-minded demon worshippers don't get it." Felix scowled at Sig and clenched his fists, but Sig pulled the wire a little more tightly. Fearing the grenades would go off, Felix remained still. "The demon owns you," said Sig. "You're no better than a food gatherer to it, and if you fail to do your job, you will be destroyed. Between the two of you, Lizard is the one that is free. If I was not bound by your trap, I would cut out your tongue," shouted Felix. He was so angry that even in the dark, everyone was able to see the spittle fly from his lips. "Then let me free you," said Sig with a smile. His voice was filled with eagerness and resolution. He was not afraid of Felix's light. "Sig," said Lizard, trying to snap his friend out of what he believed to be a pointless power struggle. Sig ignored him and rushed to stand right in front of Felix. "Sig, stop it. He'll kill Daniel first and then we'll be in the same situation as before." Sig punched Felix Light in the jaw with an incredibly powerful uppercut. As Felix flew into the air, he nearly immediately lost consciousness. The wires on the grenades pulled the pins out. Sig grabbed Felix in the air by his ankles, then swung him around and threw him away from the others. As he put his hands on his hips and looked at his friends, the grenades went off, lighting up the dark crevice behind him. Sig laughed loudly as the others covered their eyes and ears, even though the blast completely overpowered his laughter. Of course, the bright light and loud bang also attracted the attention of unwelcome eyes from far away. Zeta 28 rolled up on her tank treads to a ridge not far from the crevice with a large cloaked man. "Experiment number 31, she hissed. "I believe we have found the fast man and his friends.